American. My great-grandmother was, I said that like I'm at AA, right? Like a confession. I'm Italian. My name is Anne, and I'm Italian-American. My great-grandmother was a shepherdess in her little village an hour north of Naples in the mountains. Southern Italy is not known for tall, blonde, blue-eyed women, but in fact that's what my great-grandmother was. So she stood out in that town. My great-grandfather was a tax collector for the King of Italy. And when he came to town, people hid in their basements because they, those taxes were one of the reasons for the great exodus from Italy to the United States in the late 1800s. So he was probably the least popular guy, perhaps in all of Italy, in the late 1800s. We went into that village. He saw my grandmother out in the fields with her flock, and her staff, I guess. And he went up to her and said, or so the story goes, I'm going to marry you and I'm going to take you to America. And she's like, first of all, we all hate you, you're the tax collector. Secondly, I don't even know your name. I don't want to marry you. And third, I don't want to go to America. However, he was very persuasive, and in fact, they did get married and come to America and settled in Rhode Island in a small town, like all immigrants at that time, to work in the mills there. My mother's 84 and still lives in the house they bought when they moved here. My mother was born in what is now the TV room. She was one of 10 children. My great-grandmother, who I knew, she died when I was 8, and we lived with her, and my grandmother, and 3 great aunts and great uncles, and a widowed aunt and her daughter, my mother, my father, my brother, and me, 1 bathroom. So I'm really good on car trips, because I can hold it forever, Anyway, so my great-grandmother came to the United States never wanting to, and she could never learn English. I used to be so afraid of her because when she'd speak Italian, it was terrifying to me. I didn't understand her. And she was so unhappy that when she had my grandmother, Rose, she convinced my great-grandfather that they should go back to Italy, and they did. But pretty quickly after they got there, my grandmother got what we think was scarlet fever. And this little mountain village, where still there's no cars, it's still a pedestrian village, had no doctor. So my great-grandfather went 2 days to find a doctor and 2 days back, and by the time the doctor arrived, he said, there's nothing I can do for this baby, she's going to die. So my great-grandmother, like every good Italian mother, went to the church with my grandmother and made a bargain, and I know we've all done that at some point, made a bargain, in her case with the Virgin Mary, that's the patron of the village, and said, if my daughter lives, I'll give up the thing I love second best, which is Italy. And my grandmother lived, and they came back to the United States, and my great-grandmother never returned. And she was heartbroken for her entire life. She lived to be well into her 90s. Even when my parents lived in Naples for 3 years in the 1950s and sent her plane tickets to visit them every Christmas, she wouldn't go. She said, I made a promise I could never go back. So it was her great heartache, that she gave up her homeland, really. When people say the old country, it conjures a lot of things, but when she said it, it was like saying her mother. It was like really deeply rooted association. My grandmother was quite beautiful. She was not like my tall great-grandmother, her mother. She was quite short. She was only 5 feet tall with tons of red curly hair and green eyes. And she was in love with a boy in town. Now, our part of our town was all Italian, even in the 50s and 60s and 70s when I was a kid. People spoke Italian. It was all Italian immigrants. When I looked out my bedroom window, I saw little old Italian ladies dressed in black with kerchiefs and baskets that they wove themselves, filled with the fruits and vegetables from like our communal gardens. On Christmas Eve, everybody would go into the gardens and beat the fig trees. And say in Italian, we're beating you. If you don't bear fruit next year, we're going to cut you down. So it was like a threat to the fig trees. My great-grandmother was a strega, a witch, and there would be people lined up outside our house when I was a kid for her to cure them of various illnesses, to find out if so-and-so was their true love. She refused to do black magic. She only did white magic, but my grandmother was sort of the opposite. I'll get to that. She liked the black magic stuff. So my grandmother was in love with a boy. She was 16 when her parents, my great-grandparents, told her that she was getting married. And they thought they'd found a great match For Italian immigrants then, it was considered very desirable if you were a Northern Italian, Rome and up, if you had any education and the man she was betrothed to had graduated from high school, considered huge. If you were born in the United States, but were Italian, and he was born in the United States, and if you had a business, and he owned 2 barber shops, so he had like a craft, you know. And my grandmother was 16. She found out she was getting married on her wedding day. My grandfather was 32. She looked out the window in her wedding dress sobbing, because she loved a 16-year-old boy, and looked down, and she would always say to us, and he was old, and he was ugly. So she climbed out the window and found the boy she loved, and my great-grandmother found them making out down by the river and dragged my grandmother to her wedding. They said there was mud on the hem of her wedding dress. Well, I grew up with these stories and many more like them. And like every kid, I didn't want to hear them. I mean, there was a certain appeal, you know, the romance, the broken heart, the country you can't have. But for the most part, you hear the same stories over and over. And as I got older and, you know, I just wanted to go out with my friends. I especially didn't want to. We were very old-fashioned Italians. You sat at that kitchen table until an elder released you, you know. So I didn't listen as much as I should have. And I know many of you have experienced this. And then one day you look up and all the people are gone. And now you want to hear the stories. You know, and it's too late. So I was finishing a novel 15 years ago. I was going to an artist colony in Saratoga Springs, New York to finish my book. And I went out to dinner with my mom the night before. And she tells me this crazy story, that in the 1930s, when she was a girl, the Italian-American community supported Mussolini. And they would have huge Mussolini rallies. And someone would pass a flour sack, and the families would give their gold and money for the good of Italy, and it would be sent off to Mussolini. And I said, how can it be? I've never heard that story. I've heard so many stories. And she said, oh no, we did it. And to prove it, she got on the kitchen table and sang in Italian a pro-Mussolini song. So as I'm driving to Saratoga Springs the next day, I'm not thinking about the novel I'm supposed to be finishing. I'm thinking about this Mussolini business, you know, and how I didn't know about it. So when I got, you know, moved into my little room, I immediately went to the library in town. And I started reading everything about Mussolini and Italian-American immigrants, in particular in New England, and what I could find about Rhode Island, where my family settled. And I wrote a short story called Dear Mussolini, where I filled in all the blanks of the story my mother had told me. You know, I created a matriarch, not unlike my great-grandmother, who didn't speak English. I created a very good Italian Catholic girl like my mother was, and a negative, sort of bad, didn't want to be Italian, wanted to be an American sister like one of her sisters had been, and created a whole story around this idea of the Italians being dedicated to Mussolini. And once I wrote it and sent it off for publication, I could get back to my novel. And this became a pattern I had over the next 15 years. It seemed like whenever I had a deadline, the thing I would do is write a story of what I called my family. Now, they weren't my family, because I didn't have the stories for my family. So I would take a little thing I had heard and spin it into a story. I thought a lot about immigration and about the Italian-American immigrant neighborhood in which I grew up. Because to my mother and her 9 sisters and brothers, it was an embarrassment to be Italian. They were picked on. None of my generation was allowed to learn Italian because they had been made fun of because they spoke it. And so I talked to my mom and my aunts, who were the ones who were alive during that time, a lot about what that felt like and what they wanted and what they admired. And they wanted education, but they didn't know how to get it. They wanted to be American, whatever that meant to them, but they didn't know how to do that. They wanted some kind of power. You know, my great-grandmother never learning English, she lost a lot of power. She could never leave her village because she didn't know how to get around. She didn't know how to ask for help or directions. So I thought a lot about what are the ways in which immigrants lose power when they come to a new country. And I applied it to this fictional family. When I was a kid, and my mother was trying so hard, and my aunts were trying so hard to have my generation be just American, I wanted that too, but here I lived in this immigrant neighborhood, you know? Like, I wanted to live in the house that Samantha from Bewitched lived in. I thought that was like the perfect house. And here we had this house, you know, that had had additions put on to accommodate all the people and only had the one bathroom, and there was always cousins and aunts and people that, you know, hadn't lived there yesterday were there today. So many people around the kitchen table. It makes me so sad now because that kitchen table is pretty empty, but so many people around that kitchen table. I used to hide upstairs and read just for quiet. You know, it was such a noisy house. And so my great-grandmother really ran that household. And she was a very strong woman. She was only afraid of two things: flush toilets, because she thought they sucked you down. So although we had one, she kept an outhouse in our backyard, which is like the worst. You know, here I am in like an American school, and I'm feeling so embarrassed. Where do you live, Anne? The house with the outhouse. You know, a house with the outhouse. When I told a middle school this story, I got letters from them. You know, they write you thank you letters after. And the thank you letter said, "Dear Ms. Hood, we loved your stories of growing up on the prairie." And I was like, I grew up right in the middle of a town. I didn't grow up on the prairie. The other thing my great-grandmother was afraid of was a furnace. She thought that it sent out toxic fumes and killed you when you slept. So although we got the flush toilet, no furnace was allowed. So until 1968, we had a coal stove. Another huge embarrassment. And probably the last living coal man in Rhode Island or New England would come, and my grandmother and great-grandmother would be out there, you know, shoveling that coal, stoking that stove on winter mornings. The most popular girl in my school was this girl, Michelle Kincaid. And she was so popular that she told us the Beatles wrote the song Michelle for her, and we believed her because she was so fabulous. Of course Paul McCartney would sing to her, you know. So she finally, my dream came true, and she invited me over after school one day. And she lived in the new development, like we lived where all the old Italian families lived. And she lived in a split ranch house. And I was like, you know, architecture has peaked. Who would ever want to live in any other? You entered downstairs, you know. And then we went up, and all I saw was this sea of wall-to-wall carpeting. And I was like, this is so beautiful. You know, we had terrible hardwood floors, you know. So it'd be like mauve and then like a light blue, powder blue, and then like a coffee color down there. And they had a dishwasher. And I'm not kidding. I said, what is that? She's already regretting that I'm there. She said, it's a dishwasher. I said, it's washing your dishes? Meanwhile, in arrives Grandma visiting them from Oklahoma. Now, when I had to kiss my grandmother and great-grandmother goodbye in the morning, they were like slaughtering chickens in the backyard, blood splattered, and I'd have to give them a hug, you know. And so here comes the cleanest woman I've ever seen, you know, right out of Central Casting, holding a tray of snickerdoodles, a cookie I still can't bear to look at, because it reminds me of this day. And I got really overwhelmed by jealousy. And I said, I have a stomach ache, and I ran all the way home. And I ran in the back door into the kitchen. That's how Italian Americans enter their house always. And Mama Rose was standing at the stove, stirring something. I always say she looked like one of the witches from Macbeth. You know, she's standing over there. She mutters something at me in Italian, and I yell, I hate my life. And I run upstairs, and I write the first short story I ever wrote. I was 8 years old. And it was about a little girl who comes home from school one day, and her grandmother has vanished. And the little girl's life gets so much better. Because I'm Italian and superstitious, I didn't harm her. She was just like gone. And I realized the power of stories, because when I went downstairs to dinner that night, she didn't look so bad. In fact, I always think that when I went downstairs after writing that first story, the world had sort of tilted slightly, and I saw everything differently. So when I began to write these stories that became my book, An Italian Wife, which you will not hear anything from, when I began writing those, I realized that I was going back to all these memories and to all these ideas of how it seemed to be other. The little girl who really wants to be American and is surrounded by Italians. The woman, like my mother, who wanted to be, you know, as American as can be, and held on tight to her Italian roots. All of the people, all the cast of characters around me. So for 15 years I was writing these stories. What about this generation? What about this woman? What about that woman who's the matriarch in that very first story I wrote called Dear Mussolini? Where did she come from? And what was her heartache? You know, was she longing for her country? In a way, I conflated my great-grandmother and grandmother to create the character of Josephine. I made her a shepherdess in her village, and I made her have an arranged marriage to a man she never loved. You know, my grandmother had 10 children and never loved her husband. And there were always rumors, and even at Thanksgiving, the one aunt who makes everybody really mad always says, she had a lover, your grandmother had a lover. And it used to sort of offend me, but now I think, I hope so, because I hope she found some happiness, you know, in her lifetime. And so I took all of these and created stories from them. Gave this conflated character a lover, some happiness, you know. But of course it's fiction, so I had to torture her a little too, and had that child with that lover be given away for adoption. And her search for that child kind of is the engine of the book. I always saw them as short stories. I never even imagined them sort of connected. And then a couple of years ago, I wrote one called Captain Macaroni, about a little boy who in the 1970s loves his great-grandmother when others are like so done with her, and loves being Italian. He lives in Waspy, Connecticut. Everybody looks the same, and he realizes he's got something different and special, and he wants to explore that. And I thought, I've just saved the family. This boy is going to grow up, and he's going to be the one doing the 7 fishes on Christmas Eve. You know, he's going to be the one making the Easter bread. The stories span 100 years, so they end in the 70s. And I was so happy. I was like, I'm not going to, my family's done, you know? And I put the story in the Dear Mussolini file, which is what I always called it. And I realized I had over 300 pages of these stories. So I printed them out, and I put them on my dining room table, and I kind of walked around and around the table, seeing if there was any order to them. And I realized that, not deliberately, the stories sort of were organized, or I could organize them around 3 wars, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. So that's how I grouped them. You know, when I wrote my first novel, back in the dark ages, I always say I carved it into my cave wall. When I wrote my first novel, I was afraid to write a novel. It seemed like a huge undertaking. I thought writing short stories was easier. I've changed my mind about that. But, and so I wrote these interconnected short stories. At that time I didn't have a table, so I put them on the floor and like on my knees walked around and around them to find their order. And when I finally did and I finished that, turning those stories into a novel, I thought I'll never write a book that way again. So some people never learn. Here I am like 30 years later, and I did it the exact same way, except I had a table now. And so I went around and I organized them, and I didn't tell my agent anything, I just sent them to her, her, and said, what do you think? And she said, I love it. Wouldn't you have time to write a novel? You know, you just had a book come out. And I said, oh, I wrote them as stories. So she said, I'll tell you what, let's send it to your editor and not give her any information either and see what she thinks. And she said the same thing. She saw it as a novel. Ultimately, we decided not to label it, which is one of the things I like to tell people when they're writing. Don't worry about which genre it falls into or what your market is. Just write what you want to write and sort it out at the end, you know, and that often works, and it certainly did in this case. So it just says an Italian wife, and the promotional material says, you know, an intergenerational saga or a family saga. And that's how I see it. Because as a novelist, I know there's big gaps in the stories. I pursued one character, you know, maybe just for one chapter, and neglected many characters, especially the ones who were kind of happy in fiction. You know, what did Tolstoy say? All happy families are alike. I'm more interested in the unhappy ones and what's making them, what are their conflicts, and how can I help them out. So it covers many characters. You get a nice family tree in the beginning, though. And I typically read, when I think to bring a copy of the book, I typically read the section where Josephine, the matriarch, it ends the first third of the book. So it's the World War I section, when she finds herself in Vermont with her surly daughter. And the only thing she knows about this daughter she gave up for adoption is that she was given to a family in Vermont. And she doesn't know that Vermont is huge. And she doesn't speak English. So she carries this hope that she'll find the child. And she and her surly daughter are in a diner, and a family of parents and a daughter, a little girl that would be the right age, stop, and Josephine convinces herself that that little girl is her daughter and is trying to communicate with her. So she runs out into the street after her, and she follows the family until they disappear. And that begins her realization that this will be her life from now on. That any time she's in a train station or a church or Vermont at all, she'll be hoping to glimpse that child she'll never see again. That's the section I usually read, and that ends the first section, and then we start with the next generation. That child grows up and is one of the points of view in the book. And as she reaches middle age, she begins to look for Josephine. I can't tell you what happens, though, at the end. So, because I don't have a copy of the book with me, and I want to leave time for questions, too, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my process in writing. That book came out last September, and it'll come out in paperback in a couple months, 3 months, I guess. And because it had been written over the course of 15 years, when I finished it, I really had a lot of free time between when I finished it and when it actually came out. It just takes a couple years for that to happen. So I could readily begin another book, which I have finished. And that book is called The Book That Matters Most. And it's coming out next June, and it's a novel about a woman who joins a book club and how she relearns how books can save us. I am deep in revision on that book. So when the wonderful people in Aspen said, bring something you haven't read aloud, typically I would have brought something from that book, but I've completely torn it apart. So to me, it's sort of like saying, have someone over for dinner while you're renovating your dining room, you know, or your kitchen. You don't have a stove, the burners are over here, but cook something, and they all have to sit on the floor. That's what it feels like. So I couldn't read from that book, nor can I still. Every afternoon this week, I'm up there trying to put it back together again, reconstruct it. When I sent it to my agent to read, and my editor to read, back in, I guess it was like March or April, I knew that I wouldn't hear from them for several months. They're busy people, you know. And I know my personality, and I'm like many writers, I would obsess about what they were thinking as they read The Book That Matters Most. So what I always do is the day I mail that manuscript to my editor, well, now we do it by email, but you know, the day I send it to her, I begin my next book. And what I'm going to read to you is the 7 pages, so I'm actually reading you an entire novel as it exists, because all I have are 7 pages, of the book that when this summer ends and I've finished my revisions on The Book That Matters Most, this is the book I'll be working on for the next 3 years. And the way I write a book is I need to start, and by start I mean anywhere from 7 to 12 to 15 pages. And then I stop, because I think, aha, I know my story. Often, I then begin research. Even when I wrote my novel, The Knitting Circle, which was a contemporary novel, I did research on knitting beyond what a person would do. I mean, the day I realized I was reading about Latvian wedding mittens, I knew I'd done too much research. I was like, I'm never going to write about Latvian wedding mittens, you know? And then I knew I was ready to write. This new novel, the title is The Museum of Tears, covers many countries. It's big and scary and exciting. And so I've got my 7 or 8 pages, and then I will research starting in September when that book is revised, and then you won't see me for a couple years because I'll be so busy writing it. So you're going to hear the thing that sort of jump-started it. And I believe it'll be the beginning, but you never know. So you're seeing something really at an early stage. Giuseppe Piccolo, master craftsman of Presepe, hurried along the streets of Naples with a box of glass tubes. It was April 1933, and in April, Giuseppe and his brother Vincenzo worked day and night to complete the figurines for the nativities. They wrapped the wire bodies in twine. They carved arms and legs from wood and molded heads from terracotta. They sewed and pressed silk from San Lucio for the clothes. And they painted the expressions on the faces, the delicate features, the glass eyes. Yes, of course, for the Blessed Virgin and Joseph and the 3 wise men, but also for the pizza maker, the sausage maker, the pasta maker, the fruit and vegetable vendors, the fishmongers, butchers, carpenters, opera singers and politicians, even Pope Pius, God bless his soul, and Toto, the Prince of Laughter. The Presepe was not just Bethlehem, it was Naples. That translates as nativity, by the way. Back at the shop on Via San Gregorio Armino, Vincenzo mixed the paints. He created not just black, but nerissimo, black as night. He created every shade of white, bianco sporco, which was off-white, and pasta in bianco, which was the color of pasta with cheese and olive oil and butter. and the white of someone who is sick, and the white of someone who is frightened. And Vincenzo's reds, rosso brillante, vermiglio, porporo. He created the red of a blush, the red of lobsters, which was different than the red of crayfish, which was different than the red of peppers. Vincenzo's blues, pale blue, light blue, baby blue, cobalt blue, sea blue, even Madonna blue, used only for the Blessed Virgin's cloak. All of these colors and more, Vincenzo was mixing as he waited for the glass tubes to store them. The glass tubes that rattled in the box Giuseppe clutched as he hurried toward Via San Gregorio Armeno. By summer, the figures would be finished, and they would begin to carve the wooden stables and the other items needed to set the scenes. But for these past 4 months, and for several more to come, all Giuseppe could think about were the figures. How to capture Toto's distinctive chin. How to capture the Pope's holiness. How to make Santa Lucia's eyes on the platter look like eyes and not 2 fried eggs. These questions so perplexed Giuseppe on his journey back to the shop that he almost didn't hear the woman crying. The sound was so soft, so muffled, that at first he thought it was a cat meowing. But as he neared the park, he realized that it wasn't a cat at all. It was a sad woman sitting on a bench with her face dropped into her hands and her shoulders moving up and down. Giuseppe hesitated. He did not know how to talk to women. They frightened him. Their soft skin, their tumbling hair, their tinkling voices and delicate hands, all of it so foreign, so different. And a crying woman, that was even more terrifying. And this crying woman was large, with a helmet of dark curls and bare shoulders beneath an exceedingly long feathered boa. As if she sensed Giuseppe's presence, she looked up, her face a blur of makeup that had run together by her tears, black rivers of tears that moved down her cheeks, and her eyes shone from black smudged lids. "Are you all right?" Giuseppe asked her. "No, you fool," the woman said harshly. "If I were all right, would I be sitting here crying like this?" As if her words reminded her of her heartache, she began to cry again, harder and louder than before. Giuseppe carefully set the box of glass tubes on the ground beside the bench and sat down next to her. He had the desire to pat her on the back, a gesture of comfort that his mother used when he'd had nightmares as a child. But he couldn't bring himself to touch the white flesh of her back. "What happened?" he asked her. She looked up again, and Giuseppe realized that he was looking into a face he had painted on terracotta many times. Luisa Tetrazzini, the greatest opera singer who had ever lived, except, of course, Caruso. "Oh my," he said. But the woman didn't seem to be aware that he was still there. She shook her head and mumbled about a man who had said he loved her, but was a liar. In fact, he loved someone else, a woman younger and more beautiful. "Perhaps that's true," Giuseppe said, "but not a woman with the voice of an angel." Luisa Tetrazzini almost smiled. Her lips curved gently upward, and her eyes grew warm and less haunted. "Here is my handkerchief," Giuseppe said, reaching into his pocket. "I would be honored if it could dry your tears." She extended a plump hand toward him. "Ah," Giuseppe said, embarrassed. "In fact, I do not have a handkerchief, because today is laundry day, and all of my handkerchiefs are being washed." For some reason he did not understand. This made Luisa Tetrazzini cry again, harder still. Giuseppe looked around for something to wipe her tears. He considered the green leaves on the trees, the newspaper someone had left behind on another bench. Then his gaze landed on the box. He opened it and took out one of the small glass tubes. "Here," he said gently. Luisa Tetrazzini looked at him bewildered. He placed the tube against first one cheek, then the other, catching the tears as they fell from her dark, sad eyes. Up close, her face had many lines that were filled in with thick, flesh-colored makeup. Her skin sagged like cooked macaroni. Still, there was something in her eyes that looked young and innocent and vulnerable. He thought of Vincenzo and all of his shades of brown, marrone chiaro, marrone rossiccio, marrone scuro. Yet none of these captured the color of Luisa Tetrazzini's eyes. She frowned at him as he held the vial to her cheeks. The size of an apothecary's test tube, her tears barely filled the small, rounded bottom. But Louisa Tetrazzini seemed like she did not want to give him even these. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I don't have a handkerchief," he reminded her, foolishly. She didn't seem to know what to say to this and just shook her head. Then, unexpectedly, she rested her head on his shoulder. "Signor," she said softly, "will no one ever love me?" Giuseppe had no idea how to answer such an enormous question. He held the glass tube aloft as if it held something precious, which in fact it did. "Is such a simple thing impossible?" she murmured. Giuseppe began, but he could not finish his sentence because he honestly had nothing more to say. Louisa Tetrazzini did not move for a very long time, so long that finally he patted her head and slipped away from her. Once on his feet, he put the cork into the glass tube and placed the tube into his pocket, into the very spot where a handkerchief should have been. He wished her goodbye, but she did not answer him. Instead, she looked like he was already gone, or Giuseppe thought as he moved away from her, as if he had never existed in the first place. Later, back at the shop, he got lost in creating the face of Benito Mussolini and almost forgot about the crying opera singer and the vial of her tears that he'd placed in his pocket. "There's a tube missing," his brother Vincenzo said. "Go and get our money back. We're not paying for something we don't have." Giuseppe frowned. In his hand, he held Mussolini's head, the eyes looking back at him. He placed the head on his work table and patted the vial in his pocket. "I broke it," he told his brother. Vincenzo sighed and returned to his paints. From a drawer in his work table, Giuseppe took out a small piece of paper. On it he wrote, "April 18th, 1933, Louisa Tetrazzini, broken heart," and the Museum of Tears was born. Someday you'll read like 350 more pages of that, I hope. So I'd love to answer any questions you might have about anything at all. Writing, books, the Museum of Tears. Louisa Tetrazzini was a real opera singer in the 30s, the 20s and 30s, and Turkey Tetrazzini was named for her. So.
Oh. Well, I have two questions. What town in Rhode Island did you live?
West Warwick.
Okay. And then the great-grandmother who was blonde, that intrigues me. Did family stories ever tell how we got such a wonderful blonde?
No. No. I'll tell you something funny, though. Back in like maybe year 2000, I took many of my aunts and uncles and my mom and my own kids back to the village. No one had been back since that second time my great-grandmother left. And we arrived, you know, we're like the Beverly Hillbillies basically, and we tumbled out of this giant van in front of the cafe in the town. And we walked in, and the guy who owned the cafe and who was making the espressos was very tall, dark hair, but very green eyes. And we went in and we said, "We're looking for Simones. You know, we're from America and we're looking for Simones." And he pointed right at me. He said, "You're a Simone. You're tall and you're blonde, like all of them." And then he pointed to someone in the back. He goes, "And that's your cousin." And there she was, you know, a blonde, blue-eyed Italian in southern Italy. I don't know. So they were famous for it, but I don't know why. A visitor from northern Italy, perhaps.
Yeah.
I don't know.
In Germany.
Yeah. Who knows? Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's great
Thanks.
what you're doing. My question is, when you talked about research ahead of time, what kind of research did you do about adoption? Is one question. Another question is, I'm sure you're familiar with the Museum of Innocence, Orhan Pamuk's book.
No.
Okay, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
Also, are your novels totally plotted out before you start, you know, so that you have an outline and know what's going to happen to all of them before you really begin?
So how did I research adoption? To write about it, or when I adopted a child?
Oh, in real life you adopted?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so my novel, The Red Thread, follows 6 American families and 6 Chinese mothers who have to give their daughters up for adoption because of the one-child policy. And the main character is the woman who runs the adoption agency. So when I adopted my daughter, who's upstairs in the children's section with Stephen, 10 years ago from Hunan, China, our adoption story was pretty, I hate to say it, boring. I mean, everything went smoothly. We didn't wait that long. The families we traveled with were lovely. We're still friends with many of them. The babies were all healthy. This does not make good fiction. You know, you need some kind of conflict. So I did write an essay about the adoption experience because we adopted Annabelle after losing a child. And so I wrote about adoption after loss. And that was enough for an essay. You know, that wasn't a book. But I became very intrigued by the process, in particular, the mothers whose stories are never told in China. So it is illegal to keep these babies and illegal to abandon them, so they don't talk about it, because they could be in huge trouble for doing it, even though they can't keep the babies. And the woman who ran our adoption agency, which is in Boston, is from China, and really indulged my imagination. You know, I said, what are some of the possible stories? And she told me like 10 or 12 scenarios that might lead, you know, it's not just one. For example, if a woman had twin girls, she would get to keep one. So she'd have to choose which twin to abandon. And so she gave me 12 stories. 12 is too many for fiction to manage. And so I picked the ones that kind of I was the most interested in exploring. I didn't really have an interest in writing about 6 upper middle class Americans who were adopting. But once I thought I could include the Chinese mother stories, it became like something I would want to spend 3 years working on. We traveled to China twice, once to pick up Annabelle and once to go back and, you know, revisit her orphanage, and so that she can see where she was from, basically. So I had that little bit of experience about China itself. There's not a lot out there about the Chinese moms. There were 2 books at the time I was writing The Red Thread. One was called Wanting a Daughter, Needing a Son, and one was called, I can't remember, but there were 2. God, the other one's just, they're referenced in the back. So I read those and, you know, did what we all do now, Googled magazine articles and stuff to see what I could find. It really is kind of a ripe topic for imagination because, as I said, they don't really talk about it. So you can fill in so much and create character. And the challenge, of course, was writing from a culture that isn't mine. But after reading Wanting a Daughter, Needing a Son, in which, I don't know, 30 of these moms are interviewed, not one of them could get through the interview without breaking into tears. And I realized, oh, what I'm writing about are grief-stricken mothers, and I can do that. You know, that's a universal. So it took a lot of thinking and reading that book to land on how to portray them. So that was the first question.
I was actually referring to in your, you know, present book, the Italian wife.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, because we were talking about international adoption. Yeah.
Adoption stories.
So I do a lot of work with grief groups because I lost a daughter and I write about that loss. I'm often invited to talk to grief groups around the country. And a story I've heard over and over from older women is that when they were pregnant out of wedlock or whatever, one thing that might happen is they would their mother would pretend it was her child. And so you would actually be living with your child as its sister, right? But equally as commonly, I heard about sort of helpful but ruthless doctors who kind of preyed on women who couldn't afford to have their babies and rich families in the area for it. So I just had accumulated a lot of these stories, sadly, from women who would come up to me, women in their 80s, still talking about the child they gave away. Yeah. Oh, your second question was?
It was about museum innocence, which we'll talk about later. But,
okay.
The other issue was, are your novels fully plotted out?
Oh, plot.
So you know your ending.
Yeah, so I got in this habit a long time ago because my editor demands a synopsis. I don't have to write the whole book, but she demands a synopsis. So, and 20 pages or 50 pages. I really resisted it the first time I worked with her, and I thought, come on, you know. And I was forced to do it, and it kind of changed my life in a way. I now love doing them. So I don't think of it as an outline. And actually, when I look back at these things, I kind of laugh at how much changed. But it basically says, this is the story of, you know, whatever, in the knitting circle. It was this woman who's lost her child and gets through grief by by joining a knitting circle. And then it says what she wants, you know, her external and internal kind of conflicts, breaks down the characters who I think are going to be in it and what they represent in the book, and gives kind of a, I don't know, 2-paragraph plot summary. That plot changes a lot, like nothing's in stone, but having the focus like that has really helped me in my writing, and it's not something I'd ever done before. So, you know, the kinds of things you learn mid-career are kind of interesting. I have a funny, because I've in the past maybe 15, 20 years really liked plot a lot. It's my weakest thing, and I love working on it, and I feel like an architect, you know, looking at the structure of a book and how the ways you can tell a story. It's one of my favorite things, is sort of building that house. And a few years ago, I was going in a revolving door to a cocktail party at a hotel, and I'm coming in here, and coming out here is a writer I hadn't seen in 25 years. And he lives in New York, you know, and we're in Providence, and he's in the same revolving door. And I said, Chris? He said, Anne? I said, this is so weird. And he said, I love plot now. And I said, so do I. And then we sort of, we did get back in, and, you know, but it was just this, we were laughing. It was the funniest thing to say. But we had both kind of come of age at a time when that was kind of frowned upon, like, you know, find the muse and all of that. And we kind of jettisoned that idea as we grew wiser and more mature, and realized we were writing better novels, better early drafts, when we used more of a synopsis and structure and thought about our plots more. And it saved a lot of revision later. Yeah. Anything else? You know everything you need to know.
So it's going to take you about 3 years to direct?
If I'm lucky, yeah. I think so, yeah.
What has been your favorite to write?
What has been?
Your favorite to write.
Oh, which book has been my favorite to write? I would say it was The Obituary Writer, which came out before An Italian Wife, because I set this really difficult task for myself, and the fact that I pulled it off, I still am so tickled, you know, which was to tell the story of 2 women living in completely different time periods. One, 1919, Northern California, and one story takes place on the day Kennedy is inaugurated, just in that one day. And their stories had to intersect in a meaningful way. And so that was a challenge, like, you know, and I'm actually, with this new one, I've set myself the challenge of trying to do that with 5 stories. So I'm either going to be very happy or like miserable the next time you see me. Because I liked doing it so much, but I don't want to do the same thing I've done. Now I think I could do 2, so I'm going to try 5. 5 time periods, 5 stories that are going to intersect. Wish me luck. But I kind of have them all, you know, thought out, so we'll see. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a comment. I think the blondes that you see in Italy and Naples probably came from the Viking Scandinavians were there in the 10th and 11th century.
Oh, is that right?
Pretty well established.
I didn't know that.
You probably have a Viking in your
Yes, I do. I have the heart of a Viking. That is so cool. I never knew that. So the Vikings, the Scandinavians were in that area.
Left the gene pool area.
Yeah. See, I love coming to things and learning. That's great. That's great. Yeah.
For those 70 pages of your new novel, how much time have you spent just writing, just like getting the idea down, getting the story just started? How much time have you spent on those 7 pages? 7, 8 pages? I spent so long on those pages. It's crazy. And that's actually revised. I gave it to someone to read and said, do you think I'm absolutely crazy? And he said, you didn't describe the test tube. How did he collect them? Like, I can't picture it. So I added that couple of paragraphs where he does this, you know, and then looks at it and stuff. So I had the idea, not of this, but of what's going to happen to Giuseppe at the end of his story. I had a vision of this. And I thought, how did he get there? And several of the other characters were sort of involved in that.
And so I decided how far back I wanted him to go with this idea of this museum, which actually people come and go and visit. You know, it's one of those weird museums that exist in the world. And the inspiration for it, oddly, was a museum I went to in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Taylor's from Alabama, in 1988, called Ma Seal's House of Miscellany. And Ma Seal would look through the Venetian blinds in her house as people got out of their cars and went into her museum of miscellany. And the museum was in old chicken coops. And there were 3 parts of it. One was things she had stuffed after she got her taxidermy license by mail. So they were terrible. I mean, she was terrible. And, you know, so, you know, as you walked past, you know, like the raccoon she'd stuffed, its leg would break off and it would fall over. And everybody's eyes were too close together. They should sewn on. And so you went through this really weird taxidermy section. The next one was her Civil War section, which was really nothing. I mean, it was just like her ideas, and she'd cut out little things and made little dioramas, sort of like your kid does in 3rd grade. But the big moment in it was a Civil War soldier's foot in its boot that she said had been on her property. Okay, then the third was the First Ladies, the Hall of the First Ladies. And she had sewn dresses that copied loosely the inauguration dresses of the First Ladies, but she just put them on random dolls. So like Mamie Eisenhower was like a Chatty Cathy doll, you know, or like many Barbies, you know, but it would be like, you know, Millard Fillmore's wife was a Barbie in some weird, it was the weirdest thing. And there was a line to go into this. And it sort of started my interest and amusement and curiosity of people who collect weird stuff, and weirder still, the people who go to look at it, like me. You know, I'll go to see anything like that. And so when I had this image of this guy, what he does at the end of his section, and he's standing in this dusty museum filled with test tubes, I thought, what are in those test tubes? And then I thought, it'd be great if it was tears. You know, because I'm very fascinated by Naples when the Americans, the Allies, came in. And the saying that, you know, under Mussolini, they only ate once a day, and under the Allies, they only ate once a week. So they weren't necessarily delighted to be saved. So that period from when Mussolini was out of power and the Allied forces came in to post-World War II, the street children, this is like a great interest. I love all the movies from that time. And so that is something that I've been wanting to explore in fiction. So this guy is part of that. And I thought, you know, he's crying for Naples. And so that gave me the idea of tears. And I don't know, these are I always say my brain is like that thing in the dryer that collects lint. You know, I don't know why this is all up there and why it comes together when it does, but, you know. So, anything else? So thank you so much for coming. Thank you very much.